Whether it be the sweeping eagle in his flight, or the open apple blossom, the toiling workhorse, the blithe swan, the branching oak, the winding stream at its base, the drifting clouds over all the coursing sun, form ever follows function, and this is the law. That was written in 1896 by the American architect Louis Sullivan. Granted, his idea of a biological or natural expression of function preceding form may be a bit out of date, but it's much more apt when we're talking about human ingenuity and the creation of an object to serve a purpose for its user. For example, a hammer is used to drive a nail. That's its function. If this particular function were to become obsolete, the hammer would probably cease to become relevant. If this function never existed, chances are neither would the hammer, at least not in this particular form, since this form is designed for the driving and occasionally the removing of nails. True, I could probably repurpose it for other uses. I could use it to scratch my back, or I could use it to grind coffee in the morning. But it's not really meant for other uses. It's meant to drive nails. Form ever follows function. So you're probably wondering, hey Tristan, what does all of this have to do with swords? Well, I'm glad you asked that. But what we really need to ask is, what is a sword? The word sword comes to us by way of Old English, which is distantly related to a Proto-Indo-European root meaning to cut or pierce. And you can see this same root in many modern Germanic languages. What does that matter? Well, the very function of the thing is implicit in a reference to it. Just as the hammer is for hammering, the sword is for cutting and piercing, because of course we don't actually have the verb to sword. This function of the sword is evidently manifested in its particular features: a sharp edge or two, and a sharp point or tip. This is the form of a sword at its most fundamental. Conversely, the lack of any sharp edge or point means that the object in question is not a sword. I will concede, however, that we can allow for a little flexibility here. After all, there is a spectrum of optimization that has to be taken into account. Some swords are designed more for piercing, having a cross-section that's thicker and stiffer, while some swords are designed more for cutting, with a wider and thinner cross-section. In fact, if you've ever seen an executioner's sword in a museum, you'll probably notice that it hasn't got a tip at all. But that's kind of an outlier. It's a very specific form with a very specific function. The vast majority of all swords will exist somewhere on this spectrum of optimization for cutting and or piercing. And even taking into account those strange outliers, there is one feature common to all of them: sharpness. Because, after all, a sword is a weapon. Just because the sword is, for the most part, an obsolete weapon, doesn't change the fact that it is one. The sword was designed to kill people. Even the phrase, "to put to the sword," means to murder or execute. Now, another concession, since I know there'll be someone watching this who thinks they can be just as pedantic as I am: what about hunting swords? Yes, those exist, and they're still designed to kill, just boar instead of humans. How about parade swords, or other types of ceremonial sword? Yes, those are probably meant to be seen more than used, but keep in mind that even a ceremonial sword is symbolic of overt wealth and power wrested by military might. Even as a symbol, it's inherently violent. But I'll come back to this. The sword's obsolescence has caused a bit of a problem in the modern era. Chances are most people's main exposure to swords is through movies or television shows. And I hope I don't need to explain too extensively how that's problematic. Movie violence in general is subject to the fantastical whims of the writer and director, and is meant to help tell a story, not necessarily to accurately depict violence. And although I do love a good swashbuckling adventure in the cinema, I still prefer to see the real thing, the actual artifacts, rather than movie props, which run the gamut from realistic to ridiculous. In a museum, one can get a sense for the object, its design, its provenance. And I'm fortunate to live relatively close to two museums in the States with wonderful arms and armor collections: the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and the Philadelphia Museum of Art in Pennsylvania. And I do highly recommend them both if you find yourself in those areas. And yet, museums can also be a bit problematic, particularly when it comes to swords. Because, as I mentioned earlier, swords are weapons, meant to be in motion, used. It's completely understandable why they're displayed behind glass, in a fixed position, but this artificial sterility in a case, just like the fantastic usage on screen, can very easily further this misunderstanding of what a sword is and what a sword does. This is by no means an indictment of the general population. We've lost touch with swords and sword combat through no fault of our own, other than the technological progression of armament that has caused the sword to be cast aside. However, as an instructor of sword combat, specifically the early Lichtenauer tradition, my job naturally includes educating, and in a sense refamiliarizing people with the tool of the trade. Herein lies a conundrum. To a large extent, many people who claim to use swords today don't. And I'm not just speaking about historical European martial arts either. Members of the Society for Creative Anachronism, the Armored Combat League, and all manner of reenactors and live-action role-players, as well as those within the HEMA community, use sword simulators for the purposes of mock or sportive combat. All of those communities have their own varieties of sword simulator to meet the specific needs of their particular activity, and that's fine. I have no issue with that. Also, within any given community, individuals are likely to refer to their simulators as swords, and that's fine as well, since, at least I would hope, there's an assumed understanding that these simulators are stand-ins for swords in the context of that community. For example, take these three objects. These are common enough in the HEMA community, and my eye wouldn't twitch too much if this or this were referred to as swords for our purposes. But, let's face it, there's actually only one sword on the table right now. The point I'm trying to make is this. Let's try to maintain some degree of honesty when referring to our tools, particularly when discussing them outside of our communities. The term real is thrown around so often nowadays, it's almost completely lost its meaning. Calling a sword a real sword should be an exercise in redundancy, not an expression of opinion. A sword's form is its sharpness, suited to its function as a weapon. Beyond that, what we have are sword-like objects, a wide variety of simulacra with different functions, and therefore different forms, and therefore different names, even just by way of including a modifier. These distinctions, training sword, fencing sword, padded sword, blunted sword, Fechtschwert, Federschwert, hunting sword, parade sword, the list goes on, all exist for a reason. These modifiers separate all of those things from a weapon that's intended to kill a man. That's not to say you couldn't use a training tool to kill someone. After all, you could kill someone with a potato if you put your mind to the task. But remember, its very reason for existence is to not kill people. Hence, it is not, strictly speaking, a sword. I'm sure this will open a few different cans of worms. Mainly, what is the difference between martial art and martial sport? Regarding the former, how can one train with martial intent in a way that's both realistic, but reasonably mitigates risk of injury or death? These and other related issues will be addressed in future videos, but all of these ideas hinge upon an understanding of the sword itself. It is the pervading law of all things physical and metaphysical, of all things human and all things superhuman, that form ever follows function. This is the law.